Now, earlier we just mentioned the impact on markets in China and abroad. Of course, now experts saying that growth in China could drop even by 2%. And of course, most importantly, China is a huge part of the global economy now, the second biggest in the world. Well, joining us in the studio is Tal Reshef, an expert in Asian business and trade. And clearly, Israel now joining the group of countries sort of embargoing China because of this coronavirus. How vulnerable is Israel? Because we've seen increased Chinese investment in Israel in recent years, Israel penetrating into the China market. How vulnerable is Israel to the impact of the at least temporary closing of that market for both its suppliers and for getting supplies?
Well, Israel is vulnerable just as any other country. I don't see any special link of Israel to this economic problem that is growing from day to day. If China is the second biggest economy in the world, if it goes down, the world goes down with it into depression, and Israel included, not specifically, but with the rest of the world. The specific thing that you might point out is the fact that Israel is an economy based on export and foreign direct investments, which makes it vulnerable to Chinese changes as well as any others.
Right. There have been, Tal, some voices that in recent years have said Israel should be a little careful about its deepening economic involvement in China. Some of its major companies, Israel Chemicals, being sold to the Chinese, China getting involved in developing its ports, and are saying, here you see an example of what happens when you start to get dependent on it. Is that fair, or are people really just picking on an incident that could have happened to really any country, and that really this is something really could not have been anticipated?
Yeah, it is totally unfair pointing this out, because whenever an American or a European company is buying an Israeli company, it looks fair, and if a Chinese company is buying it, suddenly it becomes a nightmare. I don't agree with it. Chinese purchasers of Israeli companies so far have shown quite stable and quite responsible, so I don't see the reason to fear. Even talking about the port of Haifa, which many have described it as a security risk. It is not, because the only thing that the Chinese people can do there is watch the American vessels. They can do it from uptown Haifa as well. So, what is happening now with China shows the other way around, because it means that every power, even a superpower, can be falling down. So it's better to spread your investments in the target markets as much as possible, not to be dependent on one market. So a part of Europe and the United States, it's good that we are having the Asian markets as well.
Right. So clearly there are some in the Trump administration who don't agree with you on the Haifa port, but let's move on from that. You mentioned Israel being as vulnerable as any country in the world. Well, let's talk about the world. If this situation with the coronavirus continues, maybe even worsens, what kind of potential impact are we looking at the global economy?
We are talking about a possible world depression, and much deeper, even if, and it depends on many research and biology issues that I'm not the expert to talk about, but if a solution is not found within the next weeks, and for the moment it doesn't seem like we are going to have one, and if it is going to continue spreading and spreading as contagious as it was so far, which is much worse than we had with the swine fever and the SARS, then it will hit other countries, not only China. It might hit countries that are densely populated but not as organized and well equipped as China. The catastrophe that will happen if it touches places like India, like Indonesia, like Nigeria, like Egypt, is devastating. China is one of the most organized places in the world in this term, in controlling population. So if China is hit this way, I'm afraid to think what might happen in other places.
It's a good point. Being an authoritarian regime makes them perhaps more capable, even though some of their tactics, like closing off entire cities, have been criticized on the human rights level. But let me just ask you, you have experience doing business with China. They have one huge advantage. It's the world's biggest market, no matter what happens to them. How resilient, if it's contained, say even just within the next coming months, how resilient is the Chinese economy that it can recover from this?
They are having already some problems before that. Problems of the public debt, the private sector debt. They are having some big issues with America, as we know, with the Trump administration, of course. And they have less and less tools under their hands to use against it. They talked in the last 2 days about pumping money. They don't have the money that they used to have in 2008 during the other crisis. They already spent it. So now they are much more vulnerable than they were before.
Right, indeed. But as you mentioned, they are pumping money unprecedented into their economy. But as you said, China dealing with a whole host of issues, especially, of course, that trade dispute with the U.S. that has already perhaps damaged, to some degree, their economy. Tal Reshef, thanks for joining us here on The Rundown.